On December 25th, 1991, the Soviet hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin in Moscow, marking the end of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. What remained of the republics that comprised the once frightening communist state, as well as their allies in the Eastern Bloc, were left to forge their own destinies as a new world order was born from the ashes of the Cold War. This is a setting that isn't explored nearly enough in video games, in my humble opinion. There exists a handful of titles wherein the Cold War is central to the game's experience, like the War Game series, or Supreme Ruler Cold War, or even Tropico, but many of them just use it as a backdrop more than anything else. Metal Gear Solid 3 is one of my favorite games of all time, but you could easily move it back a couple of decades and nothing about the game would really change. I find that the games that do use the Cold War as a setting to drive its gameplay forward are so dwarfed by other titles that they almost become novelties in and of themselves. The state of affairs during the conflict has a cornucopia of opportunities that would allow for games to explore the different facets of the struggle between the capitalist West and the communist East beyond mere window dressing. This is something, however, that few games truly embrace. I think it's because of the lack of exposure that the Cold War gets when it comes to video games that makes games that actively use it stand out all the more. And this is probably one of the major reasons why Crisis in the Kremlin caught my eye. Here we have a game that isn't only set in the Cold War, but can only exist within the context of it. It's a historical simulation strategy game wherein you play as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union during its twilight years, and you're tasked with trying to keep the country afloat both on an international and a domestic level. And truth be told, I'm not exactly sure what to make of this video as a whole. This isn't quite a review, and while I think that Crisis in the Kremlin is a game that actually isn't half bad, I'm hesitant to make it the central focus of a you should play, chiefly because it's not quite something I'm ready to advocate for entirely. I mean, look at the footage of it. I've seen Flash games from the turn of the millennium that are more visually appealing and have better UI feedback. But under the rather cheap production values is a game that actually functions with a certain degree of competency. In fact, I think that it handles reactivity and the ability to create a plausible alternative history through player decision making pretty well, all things considered. It's an ambitious game that explores one of the most pivotal eras in the Soviet Union's history, and the fact that it was put together by a couple guys in Russia only makes it all the more impressive. Not egregiously so, but enough to say that I can totally appreciate the amount of effort that has gone into making this game work. In a weird way, it's one of the more authentic examples out there of a Cold War game, especially considering the care that's gone into trying to reproduce the political history of the USSR through the end-of-turn events, the budget distribution, the technical research, and even engaging with the factions of the Communist Party itself. This is a game where it's entirely possible to embrace Trotskyism in the 1980s, expel the reformers and the moderates from the party, and create a unified German Democratic Republic after watching America fall. It's not something that's easy to do, but the options to see this outcome play out exist within the game, and I think that's pretty cool. So, I guess you might want to consider playing Crisis in the Kremlin? That is, if you can stomach working through its Byzantine mechanics and UI. For as deep as a strategy game as it can be, it sure doesn't make it very easy to discover that. I appreciate that the game has a tutorial, and that it even offers a straight up guide as to how to beat the USA if you want to follow it. But the whole thing is just such a dense information dump that your senses feel dull trying to organize it all in your head as you begin to tackle the game's rather labyrinthian systems. Once you get into the groove of what the game mainly has to offer though, it tends to ease off a little bit. Slowly but surely you begin to see how certain decisions are locked based on the organizational makeup of the Communist Party you're ruling and how your budget is being organized. There's even a comparative statistic that lets you know how well your own USSR is doing compared to the real-life counterpart during the same period of time in terms of production and the Growth Development Index, which is great if you're a stats nerd. That, along with the number of events that you need to make decisions on, demonstrates a real level of care that the developers have put into making sure that all the details within the game are as accurate and as authentic as possible. It certainly helped that this is actually a remake of a 1991 strategy game with the same name, but this game takes things a step further than the original too. The late 80s were a time of political upheaval as well as economic turmoil. The life that most of the inhabitants of the Soviet republics knew was being turned on its head, and the familiarity of the days of Khrushchev and Brezhnev were things of the past, as Gorbachev's reforms led way to a more open Soviet Union, much to the chagrin of party hardliners. And you get to experience all of this firsthand while trying to uphold the Soviet dream of maintaining a Marxist regime while everything around you falls apart. The beauty in this is that the developers have allowed that end state to be obtainable. It isn't easy, but you can do it. Pick your favorite Soviet leader, I'm more of a Brezhnev man myself, or play a custom hybrid by picking your stance on a couple of political issues, and go ahead and keep the republics unified, if you can. But if the game's setting isn't out to get you, then the interface surely is. There's little to no feedback for your actions. A confirmation that I've made the change that I've wanted to do would be nice, as I hadn't realized that I was draining my political points needlessly. And considering I need those to perform any action, yeah, that was a bit of a bummer. The same thing happened when I was trying to send military aid to countries I was hoping to seduce over to my side of the Iron Curtain. The game simply said something went wrong without any further elaboration, and I didn't realize that I was using up my gold reserves frivolously. And while it does offer some conditions to make certain things happen, like unify the GDR or access China's markets, it doesn't offer too much to clarify on these things beyond a few vague descriptors. But these issues mask what is otherwise a surprisingly deep experience, especially so considering I bought this game for the price of a coffee on sale and, well, you've been looking at footage of it. It doesn't look like it's worth more than that, frankly. Not to undermine the talent of the developers, because there seriously has been some effort put into making this game, but the game really is on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to production value. This is one of those games that I can definitely say you shouldn't skip over just because of how it looks. If you're a fan of political sims and text-based strategy sims, Crisis in the Kremlin really gives them a run for their money. As far as Cold War games go, it offers a solid experience, especially if you're the sort of person that's geared towards the political and historical aspects of it. So consider playing Crisis in the Kremlin if you feel so inclined. It's ugly and it handles poorly, but the gameplay systems hold up fairly decently. And really, considering the options that there are out there for Cold War video games, you can probably do worse.